As the facilitator for this evening's plenary session, I welcome you to this time together and just offer a few reminders about how the session will unfold before we turn to our conversations together. We have agreed as an organization that we will respect each participant's choice of whether they have video on or off, because we do not know what it is that's going on in their context and why they might need it to be one way or another. I do ask that you keep audio muted when you're not speaking, and either Jen or I will mute you if we discover that background noise is bleeding through. Not because we don't like you or don't want to hear from you, but because we're trying to make sure that the session will unfold where everyone can hear and there's no great echo. The chat is open for comments and questions, and do feel free to comment or raise questions in that space, and we'll be monitoring it to pull them into the session. You also have access to captions and a transcript through Zoom's mechanisms, so check out the More section to help you click on that if you'd like to have it. This evening, we will be working through a series of sort of conversation pieces. I've dropped our plenary structure in the chat. There's this brief introduction time, then a presentation by Joung Chul, who's going to kick off our conversation by doing some reflecting on RE and its past as reflected in journal articles, and what we choose to publish and talk about in that space. Then we're going to have some breakout groups, followed by plenary reflections, and then a brief wrap up at the end. So fairly simple structure tonight. Anything, Jen, you need to say about tech?
I don't think so. Joung Chul, if you will just let me know at the appropriate time how many breakout rooms you would like.
And Joung Chul knows that I'm actually going to do that, so I will. So
Yes,
I'll set him up.
I was going to say that.
Terrific. So without further ado, Joung Chul, we invite you to help us think about acknowledging past gifts in all of their messiness.
All right. So thank you very much. And I am very happy and excited to be here with you. First, I want to start with my self-introduction. So my name is Joung Chul Lee, and as you see, there is a space between Jung and Chul. So people often think that Chul is a middle name, but that's still a part of the first name. So Jung Chul is my first name. I was raised in South Korea, born and raised in South Korea, and went to the United States for a while to study, and then came back to South Korea now. So I'm living in Seoul, South Korea. I'm teaching at Kookmin University, which is a secular university here in Korea. I teach religion and also climate change. That wasn't my major part of my study when I was doing my PhD work, but I happened to join this department, the interdisciplinary studies of climate change, and then I was asked to teach a climate change, so I teach a few courses there. But my area is a religious education. I studied religious education at Claremont School of Theology. So um, here I am. So I think that's a brief introduction of myself. Religiously, I'm a PCUSA ordained pastor. So that's who I am. And, yay, Kimball. So let me share my screen. Um, let's see. Practiced this just a minute ago. Okay. You must be able to see my screen. All right. Now let me begin my presentation. So the title is Religious Education in Religious Education. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This is It's a morning here in Korea, by the way. I cannot fully express how excited and honored I am to share my research with you today. This study presents a meta review of 356 research articles published in our journal, Religious Education, between 2015 and 2025. Uh, as I have only 20 minutes today, I'll briefly introduce the journal and the research design of the research, while focusing primarily on sharing the findings. So for a fuller version of the study, please refer to the paper available on our conference website. The Most of you who are here would know and understand how the journal Religious Education has been a significant place for establishing and forming the field of religious education throughout the century. And I'm sorry, let me stop just for a moment to see your screens. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So it was a really important space for the scholars and practitioners of religious education, right? Religious education is the official journal associated with the REA. There are journals that have similar names. You must know this too, you know? The Journal of Religious Education that is published in Australia, and also recently the journal called Religious Education Journal that was recently created in Turkey. But ours is just simply religious education. You know that, right? To date, it has published 120 volumes, which means that it is 120 years old. The journal was founded in 1906, 3 years after the establishment of the REA, and this is the oldest journal in the field of religious education. What I have done in this research is, as mentioned, examine research articles published in this journal during the past decade. These span from the first issue of volume 110 to the last issue of volume 120. But here's one thing to confess. I somewhat foolishly realized a little too late that 2015 to 2025 is not 10 years. It's 11 years. Uh, by the time I realized that the data set was already complete, so I decided to keep all 11 years of data. Among the journal's three sections, articles, forum, and critic, I focused only on the articles section, which contains original research studies. In total, again, 356 articles were examined. The entire research process was basically inductive, which means that I didn't know in advance what I would find, what kind of categories I could have, what I would ultimately classify the data. So there were several stages in this research, and I mainly worked with Microsoft Excel to record and organize the data, and particularly used the pivot tables, to identify patterns and relationships in the data set. Eventually, long story short, I ended up with 5 categories for analysis. The region, religion, educational setting, empirical level of the study, and theme. The previous meta review of this journal was conducted about 20 years ago. It examined articles published between 1993 and 2002 and published in 2005. The article was published in 2005. However, there is a major difference between that study and mine. The previous study focused primarily on the authors themselves, so their regions, institutional affiliation, their gender, academic position, ranks, and so forth. Whereas I focus on the religious education addressed in this research. So accordingly, my question was not like, where is the author located, are they male or female? But mine is like, which regional context is addressed in this article? Likewise, I also asked which religious and educational contexts are addressed, also to see how religious education studies engage with lived experiences and contemporary issues. I examined how empirically rigorous the research is and which major contemporary issues are discussed, how frequently and by whom. Um, So here are the results. First, region. Now, which regional contexts of religious education are addressed in the articles published in the journal Religious Education over the past decade? Plus one. Here are the results. As you can see, more than half of the articles discuss religious education in North American context, and most of them focus on the actually United States. Oh, oops. What's going on here? Out of 186, 169 are actually about US context. Only 14 focus on Canada, and just 4 address both countries together. And Europe is the second most frequently represented region, 59 articles and 16.6%. Within Europe, a substantial proportion focus on the Netherlands. 17 articles are about Netherlands context, while the remaining publications are distributed across a range of other countries. I'm so sorry, why is it? Oh no, wait. I'm sorry, my wife just keep calling my son, and the phone is coming to the iPad that I have next to me. Christ. Sorry. The third and fourth most represented regions are the Middle East and Asia. And within the Middle East, a substantial number of studies focus on Israel, 22 articles. In Asia, South Korea is the most frequently studied context, 10 articles. Oh, I don't know if you can keep hearing this. In Asia, South Korea is the most frequently studied context. So, well, the articles addressing other regions are relatively few in number. 11 articles on Africa, 7 on Oceania, and only 3 on Latin America. So, and these are the top 10 countries that were addressed in the articles published in religious education during the past 11 years. One encouraging finding is that the journal has become considerably more globally diverse than it was 20 years ago. North American context still accounts for the largest share, but its dominance has declined substantially. In the previous study, 82.4% of the authors were based in North America. In the present study, as you see, 52.5% of the articles address North American context. So although the two studies measure different things, the previous one examined the author's institutional locations, whereas this study examines the regional context addressed in the articles. Research contexts generally correspond to researchers' own regional locations. Taken together, these findings suggest that the journal has become considerably more regionally diverse over the past 2 decades. Now the second analysis, that's about the religious context of the religious education that the article addressed. The results are as follows. As you see, the religious context of the research in religious education are predominantly Christian, 63.2%. Following the classification system of the Pew Research Center, I put Latter-day Saints into Christianity as well. There are 8 of them. Unfortunately, Protestant and Catholic contexts were not distinguished here because in a number of cases, the articles did not clearly identify a specific tradition or addressed Christianity more broadly across denominational boundaries. Articles situated in Jewish and Islamic contexts appeared in very similar numbers, with 31 and 29 articles respectively. Other major world religions are significantly underrepresented. Only 2 articles each on Hinduism and Buddhism. And among smaller religious traditions, 1 article addresses the Druze tradition, the one in the Middle East. And while no articles on Sikhism, Jainism, the Baha'i faith, or Taoism or folk and indigenous religions were identified. And what I did next was to see the relationship between the religious context and the regions, and there were some interesting findings. The Here you can see the table. The first, in North America, the vast majority, 84% of studies focused on Christianity. The I mean, so sorry, the vast majority of the studies focused on Christianity. Despite increasing religious diversity in the region, in Canada and in North America, only 3 studies addressed Islamic context, and 8 focused on Judaism, and none examined other religious contexts. A similar pattern was found in the studies dealing with Asian contexts. Despite Asia's large Buddhist and Muslim populations, studies of Christian context still accounted for a pretty high proportion. Also, if you look at the Middle East on the upper right corner, the no Christian studies appeared in the research addressing the Middle Eastern context. Studies of European context, now you come down to the left corner. The European context addressed the interreligious and multi-religious context a lot, almost as frequently as Christian context. That's what I have found from this. And now, let me show you the third area of analysis, which concerns the educational settings of religious education. Here, my question is this: what kinds of educational settings were mostly addressed in the study of religious education in the journal Religious Education? And there were various contexts. I need to explain to you about this a little more before showing the results. I developed 7 categories. The one is the public school. Public school is a public school, right? Including college level, by the way, undergraduate, and private school. The third is a public and private school together, the articles that deal with those contexts together, or the articles that compare the differences between 2 contexts. And fourth, the one addressing faith community. The fifth, academic setting, the ones that talk about the graduate education and graduate school level, and also about the guild. The 6 other settings, which includes like prisons, hospitals, military settings, orphanages, and NGOs, and so forth. 7 is the non-specific. Those did not specify the academic settings or that are heavily theory centered. So academic setting, the results are as follows. The findings demonstrate that although slight differences exist across categories, the overall distribution remains relatively balanced rather than heavily concentrated in any single setting. And here are more findings. When we look at the educational context in relation to regional context, several patterns emerge. Although we have very relatively balanced distribution, when we look at the whole, if we look at it by region, there's a little pattern. First, among the research dealing with North American context, those addressing public school contexts are really rare. Only 7 out of 187 articles address the public school context. And studies addressing private schools, faith communities, and non-specific settings in North American context appear pretty many more and in balanced proportions. And second, however, among the research dealing with the European context, nearly half of the studies, 28 out of 59, so you see, I'm sorry. Yeah, the 28 out of 59 focus on public school settings. Well, religious education is mandatory education in formal education in Europe and many countries. By contrast, only a small number of studies examine religious education in private schools. although they have private schools. Very few studies talk about private school context in Europe or faith communities. Among African context studies, not a single article focused on private school settings, while among studies situated in Asian context, none focused on public school settings. However, given the small overall sample size, it would be wise to avoid drawing overly broad generalizations. But this is what we have in our journal during the past 10, 11 years. Now let me turn to the fourth category, the empirical level. Fourth criterion, I concern more about the research itself rather than the religious education that authors address. Religious education is fundamentally a practice-oriented field. So many studies engage with lived experiences and educational practices. However, they do so in many very different ways. That's what I found as I was reviewing those articles. And I found that conventional categories, qualitative, quantitative, and theoretical, did not adequately capture these differences. Therefore, I developed a new four-level typology to classify the studies. There are these: highly empirical, moderately empirical, limited empirical, and non-empirical. Highly empirical studies are those, based on systematically collected and rigorously analyzed data, very rigorous empirical studies from the beginning to the end. And moderately empirical studies make a substantial use of empirical materials, but in a less systematic way or only in part of the paper. Limited empirical studies, they are usually theoretical, but includes some autobiographical or reflective materials drawn from lived experiences. They still use the lived experiences and practices as data, but not in a systematic way. And also that's very partial of their paper. And non-empirical studies are largely theory-driven and rely little, if at all, on empirical data. So the results here are quite interesting. Only the moderately empirical category was relatively small, while the other three categories were surprisingly distributed in similar proportions. You see, limited empirical is 103, and non-empirical is also 103. 2 points need to be mentioned here. First, practical theological research was largely categorized as limited empirical, as it often engages in reflective studies of lived experience, but tends to lack a high level of a methodological rigor in treating such experience as data. Second, empirical research has increased substantially over the past 20 years. In the previous study, only 12.9% of the articles were categorized as empirical, whereas in this study, I see a highly empirical and moderately empirical as generally empirical studies. They together account for more than 40% of the total. By empirical level by region. When the empirical levels are examined in relation to regional context, studies focusing on Europe and the Middle East show a greater prevalence of systematic empirical approaches. By contrast, the studies concerning Africa and North America exhibit a stronger concentration of limited empirical and non-empirical forms of scholarship. Most notably, among North American focused studies, limited empirical and non-empirical studies. You see a lot of numbers so far, so maybe a little confusing now. If you look at the North America, and limited empirical is 71, non-empirical is 59. Total, there are 130, and they're more than twice, double of the other two, the highly and moderately empirical studies. So I think that it's because of a strong presence of a practical theological tradition in the US. Now, the last analysis concerns several themes that are widely recognized as important areas of research in the field of religious education. Now, I selected 7 key themes based on my own judgment. I wanted to see, how these themes appear, how often, these themes appear in the research in religious education. They're race, gender, decoloniality or postcoloniality, ecology, environment, interfaith, religious literacy, and digital technology. The question is, how much attention have these themes received? And in what regions and religious contexts are these studies mainly coming from? So here's a question. Which theme do you think was discussed most frequently? Um, here's the answer. Among these themes, race appeared the most. 41 articles addressed race as an important issue. It was followed by interfaith, gender, and religious literacy. The results show that a total of 142 out of 356 articles addressed one or more of these themes, among which 16 articles engage with more than one theme. Articles addressing digital technology appear less frequently than other themes, but they're increasing because last year's conference focused on this topic, and many of those papers are now being published this year. They're not included in this research. So, however, there is another very interesting finding hidden in these results. If you look at it by region, although race is the #1 theme out of these 7 themes, when I examined the relationship between themes and regions, I found that almost all studies on race, 38 out of the 41, were situated in North American and almost exclusively US contexts. This means that race-related discussions appeared almost none in other regions. Only 2 appeared in Europe. From this, I will cautiously infer that although race is often treated as a highly significant contemporary issue in religious education studies and in North American context, the discourse itself may be far more local than it is often perceived to be. It might also be notable that no studies on European contexts were found to address environment and decoloniality significantly. Yep. Here are the summary and suggestions. First, the shape of religious education, embodied by the articles published in Journal of Religious Education over the past 11 years, is still predominantly American. Half of the research is about American context, but the proportion has decreased, meaning that the overall regional diversity has deepened compared to the past. Second, religiously, more than a half of the research shared by this journal is dealing with Christian context. We have some studies on Islamic and Jewish context, but very few on other religious contexts. There has been no dramatic change compared to the study conducted 20 years ago. Third, in terms of educational setting, this study demonstrates that the understanding that religious education is only about faith formation is a myth. The educational settings that RE addresses are far more diverse and evenly distributed across a variety of settings, including public schools, private schools, informal educational settings, and academic contexts. Fourth, methodologically, empirical approaches have increased. This may suggest that research in religious education, which had previously been more heavily weighted toward theoretical work, including practical theology, has become methodologically more diverse. Fifth, this is my additional qualitative observation. While the overall diversity of religious education research appears to have increased, it remains unclear how these differences are connected to one another. there seem to be several regional streams within religious education research, and they sometimes look like distinct academic traditions because of differences in their context, methodological approaches, and the themes they address. As a result, scholars often have different underlying assumptions when they discuss religious education, and even the terminology they use differs. Six, so therefore, I believe the field would benefit from a common framework that enables these diverse traditions not merely to coexist within the journal, but to engage in more meaningful dialogue with one another. Such a framework should never undermine or flatten the particularity of each tradition, but rather serve as a tool that provides a common language for a dialogue across the field. Lastly, given the journal's aim of serving as an interfaith and global forum, religious education research in the journal still lacks sufficient engagement with non-Abrahamic religious contexts and non-Euro-American contexts. So I hope that when the next meta review is conducted 20 years later, probably maybe we'll see many more studies addressing those underrepresented areas. Giloni wrote in his 2021 editorial that there is no canon, but there is a journal when he talks about the religious education field. This captures the significance of the journal Religious Education for the field of religious education. It also reminds us that religious education is not a static field. Over the past 120 years, the journal has continually evolved, leaving behind a rich intellectual legacy, some inspiring, some problematic, and some still unresolved. Now, looking ahead, one of the journal's key challenges will be to further deepen this diversity and cultivate stronger connections among these diverse traditions so that the field can develop into a more organic and cumulative body of knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Joung Chul. We really appreciate your looking back at that decade plus 1 year and helping us to see something about what religious education has been and the messy gifts that its legacy that it gives to us. What we're going to do now is we're going to move into breakout groups, and we're going to ask you to think about your own work and how it relates to the past. So I'm going to put a couple of questions in the chat. What aspects of past work in the field have helped frame your own scholarly questions and research? And how has your work felt fragmented or disconnected from the past work of the field because of differing global and contextual discourses? Welcome back to the plenary. I hope you had a robust conversation with your breakout group colleagues about the questions that were posed or whatever else you chose to discuss when you were together. As we come back together, I'm going to give us two other questions to help us think about acknowledging our connections to the past in religious education. The first is, what questions or issues from the past still resonate with you, even if you would seek or offer different answers to those questions? What questions or issues from the past still resonate with you, even if you would seek or offer different questions? And secondly, what historical figures from any field serve as conversation partners and or guides for your work? So two different ways that we might sort of bring the past into our present work through the questions and issues that still resonate or the historical figures that we draw from. Feel free to raise your hand to speak in the group or drop responses in the chat. Floor is open. Elizabeth.
first joined REA in 1983. It was very much a North American, Canadian, and US. The Canadians felt fairly overlooked often, but I thought that I was thinking very differently about religious education because I was thinking about it in the public schools. I knew about it in the faith community setting, but my appreciation for the field of the REA, APRE, I want to say community, is that we have become so much more globally aware of our diversity, and I think a lot more sensitive to how to behave. Instead of it being such an academic one person presenting paper, we've moved to panels. We've moved to being much more supportive of one another instead of intellectually, academically competing. And I really love that change that has happened. So I'm sorry, Karen Marie, I can't answer the issues or the questions of the past because I think over these 40 plus years, 42 I think it is now, they've been addressed in an educationally holistic curriculum concern, and I love the way that this organisation attempts to deal with the current issues and to bring the religious insights into the public activities. Enough of my talk. Thank you very much, everyone, for being part of this organisation.
Thank you.
I agree with the tenor of what you have offered, what you're offering, Elizabeth, and I would say that I like many of the changes that have been made, particularly the ways in which we try to include more people in terms of like the planning for each of these sessions and trying to be more diverse. I also think that there is room in each of our sessions for a conversation, at the very least, about who's missing from the table. You know, we don't have to wait until that's the thing, but you can't do everything. And so even as the data indicates, there's somebody missing. You know, we've got folk from Latin America, we've got folk from Africa, folk who are not Christian. They're missing from the table. So it's not in a critique way, it's just, it ought to be something we ask all the time and to see what comes of that conversation. Maybe again, not another theme that's focused on who's missing, but as a part of what the Guild does, it's just to have a conversation. I would love to have a conversation about what the numbers mean about the lack of Latin American and African participation, or even the predominance of conversations about race in our content. Because there's so much more than that those numbers indicate. And so it's going to take a conversation to analyze the analysis, right? But not in a critical way, but in a curious way. I'd love to just have the conversation every time we come together about whose voices are we missing or what topics are we missing and why, and see what comes of it.
Thank you, Karen. It's one of the reasons I'm curious about the question of historical figures, because I think we assume canons that we don't necessarily share, but we don't know we don't share them because we don't talk about them. Elizabeth got at that a little. I think, Karen, you got at that in our group a little. Noel, did you want to speak? I see your mic is open.
Thank you. I was just clearing my throat, but not in preparation for speaking. I did want to raise an issue, and how big or how small it is, I don't know. Not about religious education generally, but it has to do with one small aspect, or one aspect of Joung Chul's research and clarification of the research. And that has to do with the difference between public schools and private schools when it comes to describing religious education. And I'm not sure what you had in mind in connection with those distinctions. And it became very real to me when I came to Newfoundland from teaching in America about halfway through my career, that all of the public schools, and I reinterpreted not public meaning secular, but public meaning tax supported and tax paid for. So when I came to Newfoundland, all of the public schools, tax supported schools, were Christian schools, because something like 98 or 99% of the population had Christianity in its background. And the other main one I would point to in Canada has to do with the province of Ontario, which has about 1/3 of the population, almost 40% of the population of Canada, where the Catholic schools are fully supported tax-wise, is my understanding. They're all, in my mind, they're all public schools. Some are related, and they're because of the tax, who pays the bills, and not in terms of religious identification or lack of it. And what difference that would make in the interpretation of the results of Joung Chul's research, which is just one little part of it all, and I certainly admire the whole project. I don't know, but I think it's an important distinction because it's not only applicable in Canada.
Thanks, Noel.
May I answer?
Sure.
Thank you for pointing out that I think that's a really important point, because it points that how we are living in a different context. Because when we say public school, it means different things. Even this one, means different things in different contexts. And I realized it very recently, because from my perspective, when I think of a public school, at first it means the school that I don't pay. But then recently I realized that I don't know, in the UK context, people pay for the public school too. There is another type, was it state school? So there are different terms, different concepts, different contexts. And like Noel said, tax supported school, I can agree with that. That's a public school, but in Korean context, a lot of the private schools receive tech support, but still, from my perspective, that looks like a private school. So the point is, I need to figure it out more clearly on my paper. So thank you for that. And that really reflect how complex it is, when we talk about religious education globally to one another. Thank you.
Paul has dropped in the chat some references to the work he presented earlier today in the paper he has about ASD, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and the lack of attention to that. And that might be, sort of another question, like we've said, who's missing? What are the themes and topics that are missing that might be important to various constituencies or contexts, but don't get attention in the journal or in our conferences or our conversations because we don't see them as religious education issues, or we just are otherwise focused in other directions. We have about 3 more minutes. You can respond to the questions that were posed. You could name some other themes or topics that we don't seem to wrap into religious education as yet or haven't given much attention to, or other comments that you might want to make about acknowledging the past and the messy gifts that it gives to us.
Just mentioned that our language often we can assume that the one word means the other thing, and so public and state, government or government supported, private. What does private? Yeah, even in English. Between the nations of the world, it's very confused. So the awareness and the attention and the listening to the other and to enable others to speak differently, I think is important, that we don't assume. When I assume something about you and me, I make an ass out of you and me in English.
Carol.
Thanks, Karen Marie. And just in terms of the past, there's one thing that Elizabeth mentioned several times when we met with the Committee on the Global Community, Religious Education in the Global Community, and that was her reference to Maria Harris's words of theologians and religious educators holding a mirror to the world. And our doing that in whatever context we're in does help people see themselves and locate what they are doing and how they are responding to the issues around us now in terms of, is it a divine response that I'm giving? Is it a helpful response? Is it an ostracizing response? And I really appreciated Elizabeth sharing that piece of the history of the Guild.
Thanks, Cheryl.
I think something too that came up in the breakout room that I was in is different definitions for what something is in different geological areas. So what religious education means in one country or one continent or area versus what it might mean to me in my context. And the same with what practical theology is. What does practical theology mean or look like in another country than the one that I'm currently in or the one that someone else is currently in? That was something that came up in our conversation that I thought was relevant to this as well.
Thank you.
At the risk of taking time, can I just mention one more person from the past who I've been talking with is Norma Everest Cook, but Norma is not well enough to take part in our meetings, so I told her I would bring you our greetings. And for me, I'll mention Philip Phoenix's work just brought me into the field because he had a comprehensive understanding of religious education as a holistic understanding. And I would highly recommend his writing to, as well as C.L.S. Nelson, to new scholars. If you don't know Philip Phoenix, Phenix, and his education in the worship of God.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I see we have some dynamic interaction going on between Tabitha and Paul around disability studies things. So we might see a bit more about that if we see that work happening together. All right, we are a few minutes away from the end of our session. And I just both want to thank Joung Chul for being willing to use his work as a sort of seed to a conversation about acknowledging the past. And also say that in our next couple of plenaries, we will be focusing on exploring contemporary challenges, and we'll spend quite a bit of time in breakout groups thinking about how some of these various topics or themes that have animated us or might animate us are challenges for religious education in this time. And then we'll also imagine future approaches. Again, not to solve or exhaust all the possibilities, but just to get us moving from our recognition of how the past influences and how we wrestle with the challenges to remind us to also imagine what could be and to continue to do that work. So that will be the arc of these plenaries over the next couple of days. Thank you all for being present, whatever time of day or night it was for you. And thank you again, Joung Chul, for being the one who helped us make this happen.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.